Welcome, everybody. Oh, yeah. Welcome to In the Lab, Monument Lab's Fellows Roundtable, our first ever. I'm Yolanda Wisher, Senior Curator, and I'm so excited to be here. And today we're so excited to be joined with our 4 Monument Lab Fellows from the 2025 cohort. The Monument Lab Fellowship program is a really innovative program that allows us to tap into individuals around the country in a variety of disciplines who are really innovating in the field of monument making. And we invite them and help to resource their projects to develop those ideas so that we can learn from them. So this cohort is focused on the theme of learning this year. And so when we were looking for folks in this cohort, we were looking for groundbreaking educators. And our use of the word educator was really broad, right? Because there were lots of different ways that folks could show up as educators here. And these are folks who are creating projects that are using learning as a lens to reimagine commemoration and monument making. We are joined here today by our fellows, Sasha Stiles. Give it up for Sasha Stiles. Cierra Kaler-Jones, Tracie D and Danielle Boyer. And I wanted to start out by asking each of you to share your homework, which was to share an object that signifies learning to you, or is a key element in your work and practice. And this could be a text or a book, an artwork, a keepsake, an image.
I'm a poet who works with technology, specifically a poet who works with speculative technologies and forward-facing technologies, including artificial intelligence and machine learning. I wrote this book beginning in 2015 and then iterated over the next 5 years with different variations of technology, and really kind of viewed this as an experiment in learning more and more about what it means to be human in a world that's continually sort of revising itself and transforming itself and updating itself. The core of this text is poetry that I've written throughout my life. And then I used all that poetry to train or mentor my AI model. Specifically for my proposal for the Monument Lab, I wanted to kind of take my adventures with AI literature one step further and turn this manuscript, which I finished in 2021, turn this into an autonomous poet that hasn't just written this book and kind of been done with it, but that actually can keep revising and keep reiterating on this book. And it's led me to some really interesting places and really cracked open some new dimensions of my practice as a writer and as an artist, and I'm excited to share more and more of what I've been working on.
The object that I brought is an illustration designed by one of the young people that I work with, and this illustration came out of the first cohort of Black Girls Soar, which is the community-based program that I run alongside Black girls and gender non-conforming young people in DC. This illustration grounds me in the Ghanaian principle of Sankofa. It is not taboo to fetch what is at risk of being left behind or go back and get it. And so I think that a lot about that when it comes to learning, that we have to know our past in order to be able to understand who we are in the present, to be able to dream new futures. And one of the young people, Brianna, she taught me this from her illustration. And so we were doing a lot of identity work. They drew self-portraits, and she said she drew herself wearing this head wrap because we learned about the Tignon laws in 1700s in Louisiana that said that Black women, even if they were free, couldn't go out into public without wrapping their hair. So we talked about, well, what did the Black women do? They went out in public wearing the brightest head wraps with the beads and the dopest patterns. They were vibrant. And we talked about that as an artistic form of resistance. And so she wanted to really celebrate and honor that history. So to me, this is Sankofa in action. It is her in the present with past and then putting futuristic aspects into it. And so every time I go into a learning space, every time I'm working with young people, every time I'm thinking about my own learning, my own teaching, I'm always thinking about how can I structure this through the lens of Sankofa? How can I think about this with time being something that's not static, something that's secular, something that's iterative, which is something that I'm learning from your work. Like, how do we think about this ongoing process of making the connections in history to who we are now to be able to dream about and create our liberatory futures?
So for me, two things. The object that I brought that signifies for me a kind of conversation that I'm trying to have in my work about how we create awareness, if not monument, to a history of segregated reading. The US being the only country ever to have anti-literacy laws. The gift of reading, of being able to read, has been denied. Black people in this country is still being denied, people of color, queer people in particular, but also the present of reading, but also kind of in some ways represents like the conflict that we're having in terms of keeping reading open or not. And that's something that I'm writing about in book form, but that I'm really trying to think about how to erect and to create something that would bring it to more popular awareness. But the thing I wanted to say is that when it came time for me to go to grad school, I worked my way through college. It turned out that part of our acceptance into grad program, they said each person needs to have their own computer. And in 1991, having a personal computer wasn't as ubiquitous as it is today, and it was expensive, right? And I remember my mom got my grandmother, my grandfather, my uncle, my aunt, everybody. We met at the Apple store, like gang, deep, right? We came in that Apple store because everybody was chipping in money to help me get that computer, which was like about $1,249 with all the accoutrements. But every single one of the people who contributed to that computer, they would never see that I would spend most of my life dedicated to decreasing barriers to reading access in both book and digital form. And so what we're doing here, what I'm doing here is trying to pay them back, right? That's the only way that I can, and I'm just grateful for the opportunity to be in dialogue. Our dialogue, learning what everyone is doing is helping, but also receiving this fellowship is pushing me to say, you have to do this, and is giving me a time frame. So I'm really, really grateful for both the catalyst and the kick in the back, or the wind in my back, I should say, to make me do something that I've been thinking about for a long time.
Bonjour, hello, my name is Danielle Boyer. I'm Anishinaabe from the Sioux tribe in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And right here is my item, and it is my child. Its name is the Scobot, and what it is it not only represents my work and my goals, but it's also something that I physically created. And my language is called Anishinaabe-Moan, and so when I said bonjour to you, which means hello, that's a word in my language. My language is also endangered. UNESCO states that by the year 2050, only 20 indigenous languages are going to be left in the United States, when there are over 500 federally recognized tribes. And so kind of seeing those bits and pieces of loss, especially after COVID, where we lost so many of our speakers, so many of our fluent speakers, it's been a problem that's really deeply personal, but also very scary to me, because to lose your language is to lose your culture and to lose a piece of who you are. The ability to tell our stories to one another, the ability to talk about things like plants and animals and stuff, and it's a really scary thing. And so many years ago, I was in the toy aisle and I saw a talking Elmo. And I remember looking at it and I was like, if Elmo can speak and teach, especially like spelling and words and all these things, why don't we have toys in Anishinaabe-Moan? Nothing like that ever existed, and to this day, this is the only thing that exists like it. And it's a robot that you can speak back and forth with in my language. So basically what it does is it recognizes English and Spanish speech to it, and then it responds in pre-recorded audio files by children in my community. the main goal is so that our youth are able to have things created for them and by them. So whether it's a language robot, whether it's the artwork that I do with my students, things like that. So work that represents our youth and represents our communities, something that you can look at and say, oh, this is Anishinaabe. I recognize these florals, I recognize this design. Like my students are able to look at it and say, this is a makwa, which means bear in my language. So it's like, this is a makwa bot. And so being able to see that, I think that's powerful. And also teaching them how to build those things and create those things. And then the other side of it is to educate people who are not Indigenous and tell them that we're not just peoples of the past, but we're also peoples of the present and the future. And we're innovators and we're engineers and we're scientists and we're creating cool things. And we always have been and we always will be. And so that's why I brought the robot here today. Thank you. And my language is Miigwech. Miigwech.
In particular, I'd love to know like the contours of your project, but also your aspirations for it, where you see it going beyond this point.
You know, the thing about reading and the thing about, you know, art is that, you know, information is for use, right? So that's like a principle in library science, information science, that, you know, information is for use. And so if you're just consuming a lot of information, but you don't have like an opportunity for reflection, then it doesn't convert. You know, that information never becomes knowledge, right? And just having access to information does not create knowledge, right? What creates knowledge is meaning. And, you know, we're in a space now, you know, where there's whole generations that don't know that, you know, that once libraries were restricted, you know, for Black people. They couldn't use the libraries, and if they could have access, their reading was policed in that they would have to submit a reading request and have that looked over by a librarian who would approve whether or not you could read a particular text, you know, or that we have places like prisons today that still declare books contraband. How do we talk about this history of, you know, policing, of literacy? How do we talk about that? How do we connect that to censorship today? Because there's a through point. We could talk, okay, you know that, you know, see, If you know what I'm talking about, just say, All right. What's understood need not be explained. So we can connect the dots to that, then that's something. But then also, how do we not create monuments to misery? Because we're in a time when we're seeing massive library funding cut. We're in a time where we have 46 out of 50 states have passed, pending, or proposed legislation to censor books or to curtail library spending. And we also are seeing the first anti-internet access legislation coming out. So this idea that access to information is the foundation of a free, of a democracy is being tested right here in this country. And so I feel the urgency of trying to map this project and tell this story, but I also know that it's a group project.
So the project that I'm working on is called Black Girl SOAR, and SOAR is an acronym for Scholarship Organizing Arts and Resistance. So we've been running this program collaboratively for 5 years. And our cohort is really focused on reclaiming monuments. We're thinking about what narratives and counter narratives do monuments share? How do we think expansively about what monuments are and what are other representations of public memory that we can lift up, that we can create? And also, how can we teach about public memory? And so throughout this cohort, we started with the Monument Lab Monument Audit, and it was really fascinating to dive into it together. They were flipping through the pages, asking all these questions. They were like, why is that statue made out of bronze? We were looking at all the top 50 monuments in the United States. We were also looking and thinking about discussing why most monuments commemorate war and conquest, and started to think about, well, what if we created monuments about joy and liberation and freedom and love and hope and dreaming and creativity and art. One of the cool activities that we got to do as well is we did a monument remix. So the young people were looking at different monuments that had been put up, and they got to remix it however they wanted. So they printed it and then got to do all these different collaging and put clay on it and pipe cleaners, everything that we could find we were using for our monument remix. And one of the monuments that I'll lift up is one of the young people took this monument of Christopher Columbus, and on top of it, she put an image of her Grammy, Luna, and on top of Columbus's name, she put her Grammy's name, Luna. And she's like, Christopher Columbus does not deserve a monument, but my Grammy sure does. Like, she was an activist in the civil rights movement. She's telling us the whole story, and so that was a really powerful moment.
In 2019, I created an organization called the STEAM Connection, and it's a youth-led charity. And what we do is provide free, like, technical educational opportunities to Indigenous students. It's basically like what the kids want to create, we create, and we make it happen from a tech perspective. I applied with kind of the focus on the Scobot because there's a lot of things that my students and I have been wanting to work on for the robot. Right now, the robot lives primarily in tribal schools and things like that, in language programs. We wanted to see the educational benefit of it in an application where people who are not from Indigenous communities could see the power of like Indigenous innovation and things. And so we've started out with like very small scale showcases and installation work on the robots, and we've been currently growing that. Something else that we've been thinking a lot about and working on is the ethical technology side of things. And that's what I am very, very passionate about. With my students and my community, we got together and we created an ethical AI framework because the robot does use artificial intelligence. So before we created the robot at all, the first thing we did was sat down with our community members and we were like, should this even exist? I think that's a good question when you're building tech. The first thing is, should this exist? What are the positive sides of it, the negative sides of it, the ways we've been taken advantage of when it comes to artificial intelligence? There's a lot of like data kind of scraping off the internet that's been happening when it comes to Indigenous languages, where like OpenAI, they made a program called Whisper, and it basically stole a lot of Indigenous languages off the internet, and the output and the software they created was super inaccurate. It was without community consent, and it had no double checks for like accuracy. We also have companies that are coming into our communities who are like, hey, we know your languages are endangered. And they're always a little too giddy about that, you know? They're like, your languages are endangered, we can help you. And so they'll work with community members and make a ton of promises, but they end up copywriting the materials and trying to sell it back to our communities. And so seeing all of those really harmful and invasive technologies, ones that have really hurt us more than help, it's important to develop tech slowly, to develop tech internally by our communities, for everything to be Indigenous-led, to make sure that our communities are empowered when it comes to things like software development. Because I feel like if all these bad things are happening and, you know, there's many ways that our languages are being taken advantage of, our sacred stories, things like that, we have to be able to defend ourselves. And I think the best self-defense in this application is tech skills. And that helped us develop a framework for the robot, which is everything is internally developed and locally run. Locally run means that we're not using invasive data centers or things like that. Internally developed means we developed every single thing in-house. All of our software was done by a team of software engineers who were all Indigenous and were all 25 and younger, which is really cool.
I've always been really interested in the intersection of poetry with other disciplines and other genres that maybe it's not supposed to like be mixed with. I just grew up writing a lot of my own poetry about the technological transformations that we've all lived through, that we've been, you know, chatting about, and thinking about my relationship to technology changing over time. And poetry is this amazing, beautiful thing that I love, that so many of us love, that we need, that we reach for, like at the most important moments in our lives. And yet I also grew up just constantly hearing, you know, poetry is dead, this is not relevant. And so I think part of my lifelong motivation for this too, bringing technology and poetry together in different ways, has been to sort of explore for myself how to keep poetry alive and beating and relevant. and to sort of acknowledge the fact that we now live in this culture that is so dominated by technologies, digital technologies in particular, and is mediated by networks and algorithms and screens. And so for me, it's sort of been this process of learning more and more about how poetry is not just an art form, which is what I was always taught, but that poetry is a form of technology, that it's a technology of consciousness, and that poetry derives its power and its force from the fact that it's actually the interplay of very human emotion and very precise, very strict pattern and form. I've been very intrigued by this idea that poetry's existence as a kind of code, as a kind of algorithm, makes it a really useful lens for us at this particular time that we're in. Like when we are besieged with seismic shifts, blockchain and AI and all these things that are happening around us technologically that we don't quite know what to do with. I think like fundamentally, all of this kind of came together in my head with regards to this fellowship, sort of thinking about, language and how we monumentalize language. And is there a way to sort of leverage this evolution of language into this new sort of reiterative generative space to rethink language and its monuments as a living system, right? So can language really evolve and grow to reflect this moment that we're in that is so collaborative, that is a multiplicity, that is a plurality of voices, that really is about collaboration and iteration and revision and annotation? Are there ways to use these technologies to really kind of open up those ideas and really kind of shift the thinking around what is literature? What are these written records that we're leaving behind? What are these books that we're writing and these poems that we're creating? They're forms of data that are going to inform, creatures on this planet for centuries or hopefully millennia into the future. So how do we, accurately think through what they mean in this moment?
To go off of that, one of the things that I've been reflecting on these past couple of days is also how monuments can be living and breathing, and they can be iterative, and they can shift and change over time, and also how memory, public memory, history is not something that just lives in textbooks or lives in the bronze statue, but it's something that we create every day. As Tracie was talking about, in a society that we're navigating together that is trying to erase and is trying to punish and is trying to police these conversations, these possibilities, these dreams, and these actions. So I've really been learning from each of the fellows about how you all are creating this history every day and how it's something that you're breathing life into, and that's something that I think we can take into all monuments. Like, monuments doesn't have to be this physical thing that we can touch. Sometimes there is a monument in our conversation, there's a monument in our movement, there's a monument in how we break bread together. I think that there's so many possibilities, and that's something that I definitely want to take back with me and share with the young people.
What similarities or differences or opportunities for overlap, collaboration, or even intended impact do you see in each other's work?
What does memory work create in us? Like, what does it open up, right? Like, as we were saying, with Yolanda, it's been great to be in the space of poets and seers, teachers, but it's who do these monuments set free, right?
How does it free us?
How does it free us, right?
Talking about Sonia Sanchez.
How does it free us, right? And if you can't answer that question, like, is it worthy work, right? So it's not all, so also too, the thing that I kind of see is that I don't believe, at least, in the short time that we've known each other, that I don't feel that this work is, about you or about you or about you, even though your work is emanating from your, body of work. I feel like it is this relentless desire that we might have to communicate beyond this space and time. That's in me, right? That's in me because somebody had their eyes gouged out, somebody had their fingers cut off, somebody was beaten and imprisoned so that I could sit on the street and read. So I could sit in a park and read. So I could go into a library and read. So I could be a librarian. Hey, you see? And so I think this thing that is about how you begin to use technology, to harness technology so that the language lives on, and so the memories in that language, right? And so for us to kind of fight technology, that's a fight we can't win. So how do we wrestle technology so that it creates those 15 minutes or more of light? And what I see is playing with destiny and with what happens and with fate and what the future is and futurity in these ways that where we both create altars which allow us to communicate backwards and forwards with those who came before us and those who will come after us. And then also, and this is most important, to alter, to change, to use our agency to change our destiny so that our destiny does not look like what Octavia Butler was trying to tell us about what would be happening in this very year. What she tried to tell us, that we would be in a place of state-controlled knowledge, where the government would tell us what books that we could read, where illiteracy would be a tool of suppression. So let me stop, yeah.
Yeah, I'll add to that. What you were saying reminded me of a teaching that I grew up with, and it's called the generations teaching. And it's that everything you do and every decision you make is for the benefit of the next 7 generations. So sometimes I remind myself when I want to do something stupid or reckless or, as one does in the beginning of their 20s, right? I think about the next 7 generations, and I'm like, I have work to do. I have things to accomplish. I have a culture to preserve, and that's not just a feeling that I have, it's one that's reflected by everyone in my community, right? But it's not something that you can do alone or on your own goals. It's that you take that knowledge and wisdom from 7 generations past, so your parents, your grandparents, and you use that wisdom for then the next 7 generations. And so I think that's like the guiding force of what I do, and I see reflected in what everyone here does as well, is that you're creating something for the future to have, And I think for me, it makes the sense of like having a purpose and the future feel a little bit less scary, if that makes sense, if you focus in, and I think it's something that everyone carries with them in some regard, whether they know it or not, like what you were saying. I feel like a lot can be learned from that. As you're saying, it's not about ourselves, right? It's about the future, it's about the past, it's about honoring the past and also honoring the future as well.
Something that's been on my mind is this idea that monuments are so often synonymous with achievement. Like you have to have done something noteworthy. You have to have maybe come to some endpoint or have reached some marker of success. And I think something that all of us have in common is that we're very interested in process, And to me, there's something really interesting about the idea of shifting or reframing a monument, like beyond achievement, or, just shatter that a little bit and think about how do we monumentalize process and learning and failure and, trying again. That feels like maybe a better, a more accurate framework for how monuments might be structured going forward and better mirror back, the culture that they're springing from. So I don't know, I feel like that's a very general thing to say, but the idea of, a monument is not just sort of like the end point to something, right? That it can be about, doing something wrong or making a mistake, or it can be about not being sure, or it can be about asking a question. It doesn't have to be about offering an answer. And so much of the work that I do is very much that. It's about asking questions because I don't know the answer. And I want to, make sure that is something that I always keep to the forefront, not to presume that I need to get to a point of feeling like, okay, well, that's settled now.
What is an unseen or everyday monument of learning that you'd want to lift up in your life right now?
I've learned so much from Danielle about the connection to land and how we understand our relationship with the land as reciprocal. And so I think that that is an unseen monument, is thinking about our relationship with the land, and also thinking about something that Paul said earlier today when we were at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, not just about what is a monument, but the people around it and how they engage with it. That was just really mind-blowing for me to think about, is how the people around it make it a monument. I'm going to be sitting with that, and I can't wait to talk to the young people about that, to think about how does that then shape or reshape what we're planning for this community exhibit, right? Of like who goes to the monument to celebrate it, who goes to the monument to physically tear it down, who goes to the monument to take pictures, who travels across the world to just be with it in person, and how do we as humans in the world and in this work engage with monument, and how are we also monument in that?
In terms of the everydayness, Yolanda, of what you're talking about, for me, it's always about how we honor the dead, right? Because that is such a visceral, and that response is always very organic. I want to say something that's really critical for me, is to remember that this is what makes us human. You know, and so we got to be able to think about these monuments also as another, as you say, portal for communication, but also providing us information for survival, you know?
I think too, there's the piece of it where it's like we're using these resources to create, and then everything that's being left behind almost becomes like a negative monument. And so I think there's something there about the things that we just sort of take for granted, and that they're so ubiquitous that we've stopped seeing them. But that doesn't mean they're not there.
I've had family members who have like spoken Anishinaabe out in public, and people have reacted with, "This is America, speak English," you know? And it's like, oh, well, our languages were here first. And now it's to such a point that when I say the name of my language, most people have never heard of it. And I think that is a very sad thing, you know, that a lot of my existence and a lot of my community's existence is kind of centered around having to explain and define a lot of what's going on in our lives, down to our languages, our communities, where we are, how our reservations work, a lot of information, because it's not publicly known and it's censored in many regards. It really makes me think about kind of the shadows that exist all around us of what especially a pre-colonial existence looked like, and the presence of Indigenous communities, and how often we are forgotten and left behind, to a point that we have to fight so hard for a media representation that's not even accurate and is bizarre, and we have to fight for people to even know our languages exist, for people to know that there are 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States. There's no literacy about this, there's no information. And to me, it's a scary thing, because everywhere I look, every building I see, every road I see, I imagine how things would look, one, differently in a past context, but also how things would look in Indigenous stewardship. And so I guess that's where my mind went, was physically the reminders that I see everywhere around me that I wish other people had as well.
What kind of ancestor do you hope to be?
I often think about the work that I'm doing as a kind of motherhood. And I think about poems as mothers, and poems as matrices. And I think a lot about maybe my role, you know, doing the weird things that I'm doing is maybe, you know, trying to, in some small way, create something that does become a bit of a legacy. I think that's probably what every poet or writer wants to do in some sense, right? Is to make something that lasts. And that's certainly a way that I think about writing, is that you're creating a little seed that is planted, and then it sprouts in all sorts of ways that you could never have imagined yourself. You know, I'm the product of many, many, many seeds, and I hope that I'm a seed and that I'm planting something perennial, I hope.
I love this question, and it makes me think about one of my favorite readings. Barbara Ransby wrote for In These Times, Letter from the Year 2071, highly recommend. I use it with all the young people that I work with. We use it as an activity. I use it with teachers to write their own letter from the year 2071 of you as an ancestor, kind of writing back about all of the things that we've been able to create in the world. And so I'm thinking about myself as hopefully being somebody that leaves behind joy. Joy as a form of resistance, joy as reclaiming, joy as just being, joy as existing, celebration, attuning my heart to beauty and possibility, to recognize challenges and to honor those, but to really orient myself to what is beautiful and what can be possible. I also hope to leave behind a heart space of community, of collaboration, of connection, that there's always a safe space, that there's always somewhere that they can return home to.
I think for me, I often think about what my grandma says to me. One, she always says, you have a lot of shit to get done. She's like, we have so much to focus on, whether it's language preservation, water access, mental health resources. Like, we have a lot to do and we have to get on it. Like, she said, don't dilly-dally, get on it. I think it can be very easy to get overwhelmed and unfocused when there are so many problems that impact, especially my community. And the idea of get shit done honestly works. It's like every day I'm working toward a goal, whether it be language preservation, whether it be equipping our youth with the skills they need to succeed in their lives, things like that. And whenever I've done something particularly stupid, because it happens, she'll look at me and she'll say, like, how would the youth in our community feel about seeing you do that? I'm like, oh my gosh. I'm like, you know, but it's very true. She's like, how would they feel seeing you surround yourself, you know, with people who aren't always looking out for your best interests? How would they feel seeing you work too hard and not rest? How would they see you always pouring your cup into others, but then not your own? And she was like, if you're constantly pouring, you know, your cup into others, like, you have nothing left to work with. How are you supposed to do good work and help people if you have nothing to give?
And one of the gifts I think of this time together has been hearing the stories of your grandmother. Yes. Definitely.
It's funny.
Yeah. Right?
We have to meet.
Because she's like the fifth.
Yes.
She's like the fifth fellow in a lot of ways.
Still loves.
Yeah, tell her.
I
feel that way.
On all of my art pieces, I actually put her name inscribed on all of the like public installation stuff I've done. And she's like, good. That's her reaction. She's like, that's right.
Right? I'm about to enter the age that my mom was when she died, you know, and it was about six months, and she, you know, went from being, you know, active and engaged, and then she passed away, not, you know, after not a very long battle with cancer, just 6 months. And so I'm hyper aware of what it means to kind of be here. I'm not saying I have my own destiny, but it makes you aware, and you mark time in a different way. You know, to me, to be a meaningful ancestor means being able to wrangle with the side of me that is light and the side of me that is dark. The side of me that is the creator, and the side of me that also was meant to destroy the things that shouldn't stand, that I shouldn't allow to stand, right? And to be in touch with that. My goal is to raise up what is right, and as much as I can, to tear down what is bad. And also to find a way to hold on to assets for my community, and also, as much as I can, in my imperfect way, to be a healer. So I'm trying to do that with this work, you know, but also in life, and so that when I transition, I won't have to come here again.
You know, how I answer this question is I'm already an ancestor. And I've been thinking a lot about it. People brought up grandmothers, but my great grandmother, I had the pleasure of spending the first 9 years of my life with her. And she was the first person that transitioned to be an ancestor that I experienced. But I felt that passing on, right? I felt like as she was leaving, I was coming in and something was being handed over. So for me, every poem is a grandmother, right? And I always look at that lens of grandmotherhood and not necessarily as a byproduct of having children, right? In that same way that you do. So I'm grateful for the depth that y'all swam in with me on this question. I really, really appreciate it. And I appreciate all of you for the time that you spent and just the energy that you brought, the intention, the goodwill, the humanness that we've all experienced. I'm really gonna miss y'all tomorrow, honestly. And I'm thinking about Monument Lab's definition of a monument, which is a statement of power and presence in public. And I feel like it fits each and every one of you. Like, I think that you are all monumental, and not just in what you are producing through this fellowship, but just in your presence, your sheer thinking, your heart. So I appreciate you. Thank you. And I appreciate everybody who came to be part of this conversation. Thank you. In the lab.